If you could select any player all time to start your franchise with, who would it be? I've seen this topic covered multiple times on shows like First Take and Undisputed, but rarely does anything productive come of this discussion. It usually just evolves into a screaming match on who is the greatest player of all time. But that isn't what the question is. The question is, knowing what we know now, who would be the easiest player all time to build a dynasty around? And the answer to those two questions, who's the greatest of all time and who's the easiest to build a dynasty around, aren't necessarily the same. There's just so much missing context to what it means to draft one of these guys in terms of how their career actually played out and what that means in terms of team building. So over the course of this series, I'll be laying out the case, both positive and negative, for a handful of players that I think have an interesting case to be considered for this hypothetical number one overall pick. Obviously, if anyone has any suggestion for a player or players that they would like to see covered in this series, just let me know down in the comment section. But in order for us to have a nuanced and intelligent conversation on this topic, we have to lay out a scenario or a set of rules to kind of work under. So rule number one, this isn't a fantasy draft. We get a chance to take a player from the all-time pool of players to start our team with, but we're the only team that's going to get to do this. None of the other teams are going to get to select players from the group that we didn't choose. The rest of our roster is going to be made up of current NBA players, and as for the rest of that roster, it's made up of competent NBA players. Nothing that you could really consider a building block or a future all-star, but we're also not talking about guys from the Washington Generals or the process 76ers. I think a good example of what I'm talking about is this current Dallas Mavericks team minus Luka. It's a group of competent, solid role players whose play can be elevated into a really solid playoff team when you combined it with a generational talent like Luka. But if we were to just Thanos snap Luka off of this roster, this is likely one of, if not the worst teams in the league. We're also drafting a player based on the rules and the way that basketball is played today and going forward. We're also going to assume that whoever we take, their career is going to play out relatively the same. That includes injuries, development. Just as quick examples, if we decided that we wanted to take Greg Oden, his career is still going to be derailed by injuries. Guys like Giannis would still be late bloomers. I'm also going to assume that players will have relatively the same production levels, even if the way that they reach that production is different. As an example, if we took a guy like Larry Bird, he would obviously get a lot less post-up attempts, but he would probably be taking 10-ish threes a game versus the 3 to 4 that he took during his playing career. However, we're not going to assume that whoever we take grew up watching modern basketball. We're basically going to act as if Doc Brown let us borrow the DeLorean, his time machine. We went back in time and we plucked whatever player that we decide to take from draft night and brought them into modern times. So whatever they were as prospects entering the league is exactly the player that we're getting to start our franchise. Whoever we take, we can still shape them and develop them for modern basketball within reason, of course. We can't just magically teach Shaq how to shoot threes. But if we take a guy like Larry Bird or Reggie Miller, we could teach them how to run some modern off-ball cuts, or say we took Pistol Pete, we could teach him how to run a modern pick and roll. I think that's a pretty good starting point to kickstart this conversation and should give us a decent scenario and set of rules to discuss what it actually means to build around an all-time great player. So join me over the coming weeks as I discuss a handful of players who have a really good case to be considered the number one player in NBA history to build a dynasty around.